Hello and welcome to the TRUUMAN Podcast, the podcast designed to create a generation of self-defined men. Today, I'm joined by Nick Isles. Nick, it's an absolute pleasure. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, and it's very nice to be here with you, Lewis, recording this podcast.
Amazing. And Nick, as always, the first question, in your own words, what makes you a man?
Do you know, since you first raised this with me, Lewis, I've been thrashing around in my head trying to define this in a pithy way, and I think I'm actually finding it quite difficult because I think what defines us as a man changes through our lives. I don't think there is a definition of what it is to be a man. I think I would define myself now as a man as having maybe a bit more wisdom than I did in my youth. I hope I'm kind. I hope I'm thoughtful. I hope I'm useful. And I hope I'm reflective. And that's not necessarily all the things might have said about myself when I was in my 20s. So I think that's how I define myself as a man. And I suppose the other thing to say in terms of what formed me as a man, my thinking, were two things. One, the most important man in my life was my father, and he drove me not to be like him. It's not because I didn't love him or didn't respect him or admire him. I did, but I didn't want to be like him because he came from a different age. And when I was growing up in the 1980s, it shows how old I am. My impetus as a man was to be supportive of my female partner. I wanted to be equal, not better than. And I wanted to reject all the sort of paternalism that, in a sense, I've been brought up with, and getting to the point where I rejected that. And for me, that transition into manhood, rite of passage, was, I suppose, when I went to university. And it was at university that I came across all these amazing women. You know, I had the classic going to an all-male school, having mates, not knowing women, these were strange creatures. And then suddenly I was thrust into an environment where there was all these brilliant women who I admired. And I thought, I want to be as good as them, not better than them, as good as them. So I think that was a very different story for me and my generation to what young men are facing now.
Yeah, I find it really interesting that a lot of people have to think about it really hard, and I like that you said that it's changed. I think that's the sort of the whole reason behind why I'm asking it. I don't know whether I'm finding that not many men have asked it to themselves, and I think it's an important question to ask. I think it's something that's maybe thought about or a cornerstone in regards to feminism, like what is the woman that I want to be and what is it that I want to achieve, but yet it's sort of we're still sort of holding on to mantles of manhood and no one's allowed to express it. So I always encourage someone to ask themselves that question as regularly as they think they need to, for sure, because I think it's a really powerful question for men and boys. Nick, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about why I invited you onto the podcast and what it is that you're doing in the space?
Well, why I think you invited me on the podcast is because I'm the director of a new think tank called the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys, which launched last month with Wes Streeting, the Right Honourable Wes Streeting, Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, as a keynote speaker. It is the brother institution for the American Institute of Boys and Men. Our chair is the president of that institution, Richard Reeves, who wrote a very good book called Boys and Men, which I believe made it onto Barack Obama's reading list, no less. And he and I have known each other for a long time, and I reached out to him and said, I think we need something similar in the UK to really be a place where we can fill in some of the research gaps, amplify the findings and data that tells the story about what's happening to men and boys in the UK at this point in time. And most importantly, what should we do about it? You know, if we think men and boys are in trouble, and I agree that everybody does think they're in trouble, but I think there are groups of men and boys who are definitely, distinctly in trouble. And I think we'll probably come onto this in this conversation around definitions of masculinity are in flux at the moment, and there are very good reasons why that's the case. But we thought we needed something that would bridge that gap, act as an amplifier, act as a platform for others, but be evidence and data led. And that's really important. It's also really important to say this is not zero sum. We're not out here going, well, we've got to put the clock back. Now men are suffering because women are doing so well. It's just nonsense, you know. It isn't. The reason why some groups of men are struggling, and most men are struggling with that question you asked me: what is it to be a man? is because we need a new script for men. Women have had a new script. It's been utterly transformational for many, many women, but we need a new one. And part of our job is to help with that process and work with our folks.
What do you think the power of data will have within this conversation? Because I personally have been airing this for a few years. I know Mark Brooks, who's a part of this as well, has been sort of having these conversations, and there are a number of men that are saying boys are failing, and usually hit with a bit of backlash. So, what do you think data and actual research will do to this?
Well, yeah, I think there are two things to say about that. Well, one is most people understand the world through a form of story, and it's better to build your stories on facts than fiction. So that's the first point. So what does the data tell us about what the story is at the moment? So if we take just a couple of examples, and these are examples that people will know well. For the last 30 years, boys have continued to underperform girls at school, but no one's really put the finger on why that might be the case. There are some good pieces of research that's now starting to come out that shows something about the how, how in a school environment you could get girls and boys to perform equally. But we need to think more about the what. What is it we're asking boys to do through our education system? Because it ain't working for too many of them. And the statistic that really shocked me was the fact that 57%, 57% of boys at GCSE level fail to get a level 5 pass or above. Now, you know, the education lobby, the DFE, Ofsted, and others will say, "Oh, schools are improving. Is this great?" Well, they're not improving for a hell of a lot of boys, and too many of them are then going off not knowing what to do, struggling, so we need to think around that. So that's the important point about data. We've also got the story around what is it that men are doing in work and what's happening to men in work. So for the first time ever, 16 to 24-year-old young women are now out earning 16 to 24-year-old young men. Well, that's great for the women, absolutely fantastic. A lot of campaigning going on, but it's not so great for the men. And there's no point in just switching the gender story, to this gender's now doing really well and that gender's not. Isn't that great? Which you can hear from some quarters. So I think data and evidence is really important to build the right story. And I suppose it's who's telling that story is also important, because if we're not telling that story, if we're not being positive about things, then someone else will. And the other people who will tell the story, they won't tell necessarily a story based on that sort of evidence and information, or they'll use the evidence and information to say something different. And I suppose the final thing I say around evidence and data, if we take the series Adolescence, which created such a bow wave of shock and awe across the world, actually,
Yeah.
particularly in the UK, I think, and the US. But it was a work of fiction, a very good work of fiction, but it was still fiction. The incel community it was supposed to be unveiling is, on the whole, not a violent community. There has never been a single case of a 13-year-old boy killing a 13-year-old girl in that way. Violence amongst incels tends to be inflicted upon themselves. 30% of the incel community are on the autistic spectrum. The likelihood of suicide and suicidal ideation amongst that group is incredibly high. So though this was an important part of the story of saying boys are in trouble, the danger is it slips into a narrative about boys are trouble, and that's how we have to view them. And then you get the whole language around toxic masculinity, which then tells a whole gender, and that's no good. So this is why data and evidence is so important in terms of the story you want to tell.
Obviously, girls are doing better in school. That means that they're getting better jobs, as you've sort of alluded to. That sort of 16 to 24 are earning more money. Yet a lot of boys are told that they're benefiting from sort of patriarchal systems and this sort of masculinity being better. Is that why you're seeing this sort of pushback, shall we say, from boys and men in general around, I guess, feminism, right? There's a sort of a pushback
Yeah,
on that. They're being told one thing, but reality is essentially something else.
yeah. I mean, the reality of a lot of boys and men isn't the story being told to them by other groups. Let's put it that way. That's not what they're feeling, and that leads to a sense of unfairness. And whenever you have a sense of unfairness, it leads to a resentment, and then resentment becomes a grievance. And the targets of those grievances are often not the right targets, if you sort of thing. You know, the reason men and boys in the West aren't doing very well are many and complex. But at heart, it's an economic story about a fundamental change in the nature of work since the end of the 1890s, particularly. It used to be called the knowledge economy, the rise of the knowledge economy. We now call it the digital economy, the AI economy now we're going into. But essentially what that has done, along with the freeing of capital controls, so you've now got footloose capital that will invest anywhere in the world where they can make money. So there's no loyalty to place in the way that the old industries had a loyalty to place, and created intergenerational work for about 150 years. And before that, everybody was working from home on farms and the rural economy on the whole. But anyway, back to where we are now. So these are the reasons driving a reduction in the sorts of jobs that boys and young men's fathers might have done who didn't have a lot of educational attainment or skills. And roughly, you could see the change that now around two-thirds of jobs are requiring higher level skills, whereas a generation ago it's a third. These are the reasons why we've got to sort out and fix some of the systems that underpin that ongoing lack of success that some men and boys are feeling. Now, when people talk about, white privilege, for example, male privilege, well, that's talking about me, you know. Yeah, absolutely. When I grew up, that was the story still. It ain't the story now to the same extent. Um, yes, there are privileged groups and there are privileged groups of men, but it's not a uniform or universal thing you can now apply. And that's why the evidence, again, going back to the evidence, is important to say, hang on a minute. Yeah, you've got some privilege over here, but over here you certainly haven't. White working class boys aren't doing very well. Black working class boys aren't doing very well. Yeah. So we've got to be precise about what it is we're talking about when we make these sort of blanket terms. And I think there's also a cultural point around, feminism. I'm a feminist. I have four daughters
Yeah.
and a stepdaughter. So I'm very pro women and girls, but I want my girls to be happy and to flourish, and they can't if the men they're meeting are failing and or resentful or have a grievance against them as women. This is a hopeless situation to be in. So I think let's tell the story that's actually happening as opposed to the one that people might believe.
One of the words that you used, you actually said, I hope that I'm useful. That was your definition of you being a man. Why or what systems need to change to allow men and boys to feel useful again, especially in those sort of lower social economic settings that you mentioned?
Well, I think it starts really with two things: how we support parents. So this is from the point in which a couple are having a child, how we support both the man and the woman, or the woman and the man. So let's look at what we do around paternity leave, for example, to enable men to spend more time bonding with their children. One of the board members of the Centre for Policy Research on Men and Boys, Anna May, has written a fabulous book called The Life of Dad that shows that men get exactly the same release of hormones in nurturing their children as women do. It's no less intense. But if they don't get a chance to do that because they have to go back to work after 2 weeks or less, well, you're defeating nature in a way. You're getting in the way, putting these barriers. So let's support young new parents. We need to invest in nursery level education and have more men in those environments. And the problem is there's been such a backlash against some bad men, the Jimmy Saviles, the Me
Yeah.
Too movement men. These bad men have then made it bad for everybody. So there's a fear factor for men to be getting involved with children. And this is also a problem we have because we need men involved with boys, particularly as mentors, as guides.
Yeah.
So we need to do that in Finland, for example. All the nursery level staff they've all got master's degrees. They understand child psychology. They're working with their children. They don't go to school, Finnish children, until they're 7. Now, why do they do that? Because they do that because they know in part that boys mature slower than girls. So they want to create a more level playing field between the genders. So start with investing early and getting that nursery stage right. Sure Start was a very good scheme. We need to bring something like that back. I know money's tight, but this is about investing in our human capital. Just as we might invest in a piece of kit or British steel, we need to invest in people, because that the knowledge economy is where it's at in terms of growth productivity. Then the school system needs fundamental change. I mean, like fundamental change. We have a school system based on a 19th century model of education. And if I tell you this, I think listeners might be really surprised. But if you look at the model of 19th century education, that itself was modeled on the sort of education a Roman gentleman might have had in the year 50 AD in Rome. You know, the core subjects were modeled on the classical curriculum. And we've still got that really today. And there's one young guy said to me, why have I got to do French when I've got Google Translate? And I thought, well, yes, I can give you a very long, and involved reason why French is fantastic and you should learn French. You have beautiful culture, people, language. Yeah, Google Translate, you're not that interested in French. So what are you interested in? Oh, okay, you're interested in this. And do we offer that at school? Oh, no, we don't. So that needs looking at. We need to shake up the school system. We need to stop GCSEs. It's a waste of everyone's time. Why are we asking children to matriculate twice? No other country, well, very few do. I mean, sure, test people as they go. Have they learned? Test their knowledge, test whether they retained it. But they spend a whole year, many kids, revising. They're not learning. They're just learning to pass a test. And then there's this massive jump up to A levels. And then when you get to A levels and college education and further education, people want their kids to go to university and do A levels. I know this is changing slightly as apprenticeships become more popular, but for those kids who've already fallen behind, who are already, I mean, they're voting with their feet, they're not going to school since the pandemic. Massive jump in school absences now and poor behaviour because they're switched off and they're bored. This shouldn't be happening. We've got to create a school system and a curriculum that excites boys. And boys need to know the reason why in a way that girls don't seem to. Girls will get on with boys and say, well, why should I learn this? What's the utility in it for me? I want to go and do that, which I like using my hands or whatever. So we've got to really fundamentally address that. And I think it starts probably, and this is to be debated, we want to launch a commission into boys' education, probably early next year, to really ask the question is, if this is a blank sheet of paper, what should we be doing? And then, what happens? And then after school, after education, we've got to keep the door open because we're all going to have to keep topping our skills up because the pace of change is double this century to what it was last century. We have got twice as many general purpose technologies coming down the track as we had in the last 100 years. And in the last 100 years, we have more general purpose technologies than we've had in the history of the human race. So that pace of change means we've got to have access to learning as you need it, whether it's online or in person. And of course, everybody is different in terms of the way they learn and how they learn, and we've got to be adapted to that. And that means creating jobs that people with modest levels of skill, higher levels of skill, modest levels of skill and attainment, ideally gained through more apprenticeships, can do. And I think where I see hope in that is certainly what the government's saying around its missions for growth, but also in the fact we need to build at least 1.5 million homes in construction. And we just had a commitment that we'll be spending 5% GDP on defence by 2035. And the construction and defence sectors, if you like, I can think could do a lot of heavy lifting in creating more jobs in those places where young men are particularly struggling to find work.
Yeah, so I go into schools with a non-profit that I founded, and we actually went into one this morning, and it was actually a special educational school as well. And one of the boys in there said, "I can't read and write, but give me a hammer and a nail, and I'll build you a table." So he was already self-aware that that's where he was going, and I see it in other schools as well. They're like geography gets a bad rap. I give geography a bit of a hit, but they're sort of done with geography. They just want to start using their hands and all of those other things.
Yeah.
Do you think there is an element of, I guess, social like mobility or antisocial mobility if you look at shifting sort of boys away from education and more towards sort of training them in apprenticeships? Do you sort of remove that chance of sort of climbing into different roles and almost keep them in those sort of roles. Is there an element of that though?
Well, I think there could be a danger of that because obviously this is around perception. But as I often say to people, well, the highest earning and performing careers are basically apprenticeships.
Yeah,
Doctors, lawyers, accountants, nurses. We don't call them apprenticeships, but that's what they are. They have a bit of studying at the front end, and then they're on the wards. They're learning on the job. The key thing around this is to understand and open the minds of people to the fact that there aren't necessarily jobs for life. They're not aren't necessarily careers for life, and that you're going to have to keep your skills topped up, however that might look. But where in our school system are we really addressing how to manage AI?
yeah,
Where are we, I mean, young people will be engaging with AI all the time. I don't know a tradesman now that's not using AI to do all their invoicing, their emailing, all the things that they're not particularly interested in doing. To be fair,
yeah,
what they're interested in doing is making money out of their trade, and they're very good at it. They're not good at that, and suddenly AI's come along. So, but where are we dealing with that in terms of the curriculum? I'm sure there's lots of very clever people thinking about it, but at the moment we need it now, not next decade. So I think the that is their danger. But I think what we have to do is, and this again starts in home and school, is culturally open young people's minds to the fact that the world has fundamentally changed. This is what it's like, and you've got to keep learning because
yeah.
and learning is a great thing to do.
There's a lot of conversations around, I guess, sort of both genders really, and sort of teenagers and that sort of age, and adolescents sort of showcase this idea of sort of a mollycoddled generation that's sort of wrapped in cotton wool and not really shown negatives or allowing to fail. Is that something that has been looked at, or is that something that you're considering researching, essentially bringing competition back?
Well, I suppose I bundle that up into how we have a campaign for bringing back male role models because yeah, you've got to build resilience and you learn from failure. And if you fail and then give up, well, that's no good. So there is an element perhaps of that. I think a greater awareness of your mental health is much more evident in this younger generation than it was before. That's unknown in my generation when I was growing up. What are you talking about? Pull yourself together, stop,
Yeah,
stop, stop moaning. It was that sort of thing. Very unhelpful, actually. And in fact, in my own personal experience, when I look back, it would have been good to have had some therapy at particular times in my life, and it didn't really occur to me. So that may make people much more sensitive and aware to stresses. But on the other hand, I think this generation have been the recipients of a unique social experiment, which is called social media. No other generation has had to deal with the pressures that brings. And the research evidence is pretty damn clear on what that does to young people and the stress that brings. So on the one hand, you could say, oh yeah, look, they'll be mollycoddled and all the rest of it. On the other, no generation's had to put up with that mental strain of constantly being bombarded with content that makes them unhappy a lot of the time. And I'm fascinated by the studies of schools, for example, who have banned, to use that word, mobile phones during the school day. And then seeing this flowering of social interaction from students. It hasn't gone away, it's still there. So I think, as with all general purpose technologies, it takes us about 20 years to work out what's good about them and what's bad. And I think we're going through that phase now. We've got the online harms bill. There's all sorts of other things I think will come down the track to try and control that. But, you know, in a short answer to your question, that was rather long winded. No, I don't think that. I do think certain groups of adults with children, teenage and other children, yeah, because we're more affluent, have been able to give more things. And I think with 50% of nearly 50% of people going to university, I also think university often delays maturation. I think young people have been maturing later because they pop out of university in their, early to mid 20s and then start having a job. Whereas generations ago, they'd have been in work at 16.
yeah. No, I actually have a real world case for that. So my brother and myself are 7 years apart. So he's 7 years younger than me, and he left school at 15, and he got an apprenticeship. He's a barber. He runs his own shop, and we're essentially the same level. We can converse with each other a lot better than you would imagine brothers that are 7 years apart. Because I'll be brutally honest. He's more mature. Well, he's as mature as I am, and I'm 7 years his senior because I took longer to get to university. I spent 4 years at university, and yeah, it's quite clear that he's done that.
I mean, don't get me wrong, as I mentioned earlier on, I think university for men can be one of those rites of passages that turns you from a boy to a man, gets you on that process. But I think it can elongate the process for some people, not for all, of course, which would be
Yeah,
generalities. It's not true for everybody, but you certainly do see that sense of extended adolescence, and people are having children later. I think the average age of women now having their first child is 32, 33. So it's gone up considerably. People, coming out of university want to carry on having a good time, I suppose, and good, because once you have children, then, that's when it gets tough for both men and women. It's not just women.
yeah. I think if I speak on university for myself, it sort of made me a little bit into the man I am. I was very shy as a kid. I was very shy as a teenager, and even my first year of university was really tough. But
Yeah,
by being able to stick it out and maybe having a bit of that resilience and that you can't really quit this, you've got to give it a go, allowed me to be able to have conversations with people that I probably,
yeah,
if I stayed at home, wouldn't have been the case. Whereas again, brother, youngest, always going to be the sort of clown and trying to make people laugh. So he's always had a bit of charismatic nature to himself. So yeah,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think I needed it, but I don't think he needed it for sure. Otherwise, maybe he would have
yeah.
been a bit of a child for longer.
No, absolutely. But I think I suppose the fundamental point for me is, where are those other rites of passage that we used to have
Yeah,
for our young men, our boys? Going into apprenticeships is one of the ways we would do that. There are religious rites that many more young men would have gone through. I think we're missing that as well. I think a lot of young men are missing that sense of, what's the process of becoming a man. And if you don't understand that, that makes it difficult as well to understand who you are as a man. And men want to be needed, they do.
yeah. I say that there's a lot of boys in men's bodies. I think you're right. I think there is a lack of rite of passage. I think a lot of things have been sort of moved away from people. So buying a house, having kids, these are all sort of
Yeah,
things that traditionally or sort of are still perceived as traditional and still see that sort of hold on to these masculinity ideologies, right? Is like they've not
yeah.
been replaced, but they're no longer existing. So what needs to change there? How do we sort of redefine masculinity?
Well, I think I do struggle with this, because I don't think there's a thing that's masculinity, the same way as there's not a thing that's femininity. I think it's all sorts of different things, and that's deeply personal. But what are the sort of common attributes? I think one of them is to feel useful and needed, however you might be useful and needed. Secondly, you don't need to be the male breadwinner anymore, because your partner may well be earning more than you. Just get relaxed about that. That's great. That's great. So how do you support them? And how do you create an equal universe, your universe? Because I can tell you, being equal is a great space to be in. You know, you don't have to be on top. And being a man doesn't mean you have to be on top, nor does it mean you have to be on the bottom. You have to be beside each other. So, and wrap arms around each other equally. And I think if I was giving advice to young men, I'd say aim for that. Aim for that, because that's a great place to be. It's a wonderful place to be. And that doesn't mean in every second of every moment. There will be times in your lives where you may well be bearing a heavier load in this way, but then bearing a less of a heavy load in another period in your life. And focus on communicate and learn. And this is something young men really struggle with, because we're not good at it. Learn to listen, because what I think women respect and like in a man is a man who can actually listen to them and not tell them what to do. And it's an instinct that all men have. They hear a problem, they go, well, what you need to do is, of course, now, no, this is, you've got to go in there and you've got to tell them, and we all do it. And that's a male trait, and just recognize it, but it's not necessarily what your partner might want. They might want just to be listened to. And that's a skill. I'm a qualified coach, and one of the things we train to do is something called exquisite listening. And that's literally not doing the sort of stuff you and I are doing now, where we nod at each other and we recognize and we start thinking about what we're going to be saying back. It's literally just listening to the person. So, in terms of masculinity, I think aim for the equal, recognize it's going to be, you know, it's not going to be a smooth line. It's going to be undulating. But if you don't go far off that, I think you'll feel a better man for it and be useful in the ways that you can. And if you're earning 20,000 a year and your partner's earning 50,000 a year, well, great. If it's working for you as a couple, then that's good. But we do know money's important to men.
Yeah.
It is important. We have to recognize that. And losing money seems to damage men more than women psychologically.
So I have a bit of pushback on this sort of narrative because I've sort of
Hmm.
seen it firsthand, right? And there's sort of, I guess, a little bit of data to sort of back this up as well, right? Which is that you look at social media and you look at there's a not old school feminism, but this sort of new wave feminism. There's a bit of a pushback on that side. I think a bit of a trend, and women sort of wanting men to take care of them again, and sort of it's sort of deemed as trad wives is sort of the hashtag.
Hmm.
And then we also have on the other side of that sort of your influencers and this sort of idea of, like you say, money being important for men and being useful. Obviously, there's a balance of finding the right partner and not all of this sort of being as easy as it is. But what I think the point I'm trying to make is that when it comes to the portrayal of masculinity, there's sort of this idea of men need to open up more, men need to be more in touch with their emotions, is the conversation that's being said. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening in reality. When men do that, it's almost like they haven't earned the right to do that. So you see a footballer who might open up and everyone goes, look how brave he is. But if Dave, who works on a building site, opens up to his wife, she's probably going to leave him. Like, that's the true reality there. So do you see any of that, or how does that narrative change in society? Because you see it with feminism, right? Girls can do anything, but with boys, we're still holding on to that. Men are X, Y, Z.
Yeah, which is why we need a different script for men. And men aren't malfunctioning women, so don't mishear what I'm saying in that sense. I'm not proposing men stop being men, and we ain't good at opening up, and we're not great with our emotions. But let's just recognise that. And if Sarah has married William, and she's married him because William is like your typical bloke, William then suddenly has breakdowns all over the place. Sarah's not going to like it very much. I get that. I get that. It's about how you contract and how you communicate. And that's true of any relationship anywhere. So you can be how you want to be, but if you get that bit wrong, you're going to be in trouble in your relationships. And most relationships, you talk to a relationship specialist, they say that's the case. I think the problem with yes, there is I mean, particularly in America with Trump coming in, you've got the MAGA women who are saying, I want to be a trad wife, I want to be looked after. Yeah, but I think that's a fringe element. I don't think it's a mainstream element. And on the other hand, you've got the sort of male influencers who are saying, hey, you want to be like me? Look at me. I drive around in, Bentleys and Ferraris. I, loads of money. In the 1980s, they had those characters going, loads of money. I got loads of money. Look, and the idea that women are really impressed with flashy cars and lots of money. And yes, some women are, absolutely, but not all women by any means. But they're really saying, look, you've got to have the looks of a Timothy Chalamet. You've got to have the body of an MMA champion, and you've got to have the wealth and smarts of Elon Musk. And you do that, you'll be successful. Now, what message does that give to the average young man who hasn't got a hope in hell that just because of his genes of being an MMA star or looking like Timothy Chalamet, nor having the money to do the plastic surgery required, and he's not a genius like Elon Musk. He's got an average IQ. This is terrible for these young men. This is awful. The same as misogyny is awful for them because it stops them being fully functioning citizens. If you're going around hating half the human race, it's not a great look for you. It damages you as well as harming others. So I think yes, there are these trends, there are these thrusts and arguments, but they don't bear scrutiny really. That doesn't mean we've got a job to do to redefine masculinities in all the ways that we need to. It is complicated
Yeah.
because the old verities have gone. They're not there. We can't turn the clock back. We're not suddenly going to be, you've got Donald with his tariffs in America saying, I'm going to bring back your factories. So he's going to bring back the garment producing factories from Bangladesh that Nike use for their clothes into Tennessee. And all those American male workers are going to rush to those garment factories. No, I don't think so. We have to deal with the realities we've got now, and we have to reconstruct in a sensible way the sorts of things that are going to help men be comfortable with new realities that women are their equals. They're not their betters, they're equals.
Obviously, with the sort of feminism movement, seen a lot of sort of girls in STEM, girls can do this, girls can do that,
Yeah,
push,
yeah,
girls in sport. Huge,
yeah,
amazing sort of
yeah,
initiatives, well funded, well sort of successful as well, right? We've seen huge numbers in increase in both of those sort of
yeah.
arena. Why is there such a pushback when you suggest doing that for boys?
Well, I think it's the zero sum thinking that goes into this. Well, if we take the foot off the accelerator pedal in doing the things that we need to do for girls and women, well, that'd be terrible. But that's what would happen if we do something for boys and men. Well, no, it won't. We can do two things at the same time. We do all the time. And when you have children, you don't sort of go, yeah, I'm going to really love the girl because she's great and she's lovely and she's really cuddly. But the morose little git in the corner, I'm going to ignore him because, he's much more hard work. No, that isn't how parents are. That's not how it works, at least most of the time. You do have moments, of course, as a parent where the git in the corner you want to strangle. And that's on both genders. But yeah, I think it's really it's really, really important that we don't succumb to this zero sum nonsense. And it is nonsense. We have to do the things that are going to help these boys and young men because we don't want them, being led down the sorts of paths they are, being seduced by ideas that are just dangerous and not going to help them. Ultimately, they're going to be let down by them. Whereas we want to have ideas that work with them to help them. And this is work in progress. We've got to work at it.
Yeah, I think a society that has good of everything, equal as everything, as you've sort of said it, no one better, is beneficial for everyone, right? The hatred
Yeah.
is no use in this world.
Well, it isn't that, and of course it's a shock because this is the biggest economic liberation in history. What's happened to it? I mean, it's phenomenal, and we should be applauding it and celebrating it. But that's not why men are struggling.
Yeah,
You know, there are systemic things we need to fix to help men get back to achieving, as well as girls and women, where they.
I think one the word that you used and the word that I really like, you use usefulness. I like purpose. I think men have lost it. They need to find it. I think this is a huge job. I think it's a big thing. A lot of things need to change. But what do you think is the first thing that really needs to change in the UK?
Well, I would absolutely start with the education system. That's where I would start in terms of system change. And then the second thing is we've got a lot of activity going on around place-based economic development. I want a gender lens on that because in many of those places where we're trying to generate new work, new jobs, new opportunities, higher productivity, the issue is a male issue as much more than a female issue. I know that might be controversial, but I think if you look at the data, that's what you're finding. So we need to be gender sensitive about these things, and we need to make sure that we learn from best practice. So where we've got some great initiatives going on that are really attaching men and boys back into education, back into the labour market, back into work, then let's scale those and make sure that they're available wherever they're needed. So I think they're the two. That's where I would start. Parents, men out there volunteering. Let's get male role models. I think Gareth Southgate's going to be talking a lot about the importance of male role models and having mentors. We need to mount a crusade on this to get more of us men, particularly men of my generation. We owe it to the younger generation of men. We owe them. That's how I see it. I've benefited. I've gone through life. I've had the male privilege. The sons and nephews haven't, and we owe it to them to give them at least a level playing field.
What is the sort of goal or things that the centre is looking to sort of achieve over, I guess, a 3 to 5 year sort of plan? Because this is no small
Well,
feat, right?
yeah, I think first and foremost to really present an evidential base for where change is needed in order to help men and boys who are in trouble. So that's the first thing. Out of that comes better policy. So we want to influence government, local government, businesses and others to do the right thing. And to do that, you've got to make the case and make it convincingly. We want to amplify the voices of others who work in this space. Listen to us coming in, going, all right, everybody, down tools, relax. We're here. The cavalry's arrived. It's going to be great. No, not at all. We need to work and be part of that coalition of sensible, mature voices saying, we want to do something about this, and how about these ideas? So we amplify. And then we want to basically develop, so that's a sort of platform piece, but we also want to make sure that we scale, so that the money that's available, wherever it's available, is being used in the best way. And we tackle the sort of root causes of these issues and not just the symptoms. Boys and men are in trouble. They are not just trouble. And, demonizing them ain't going to get you anywhere. Understanding them will.
One thing I will say on that is that it's not all doom and gloom, right? I think there's a lot happening. There's some really, really great stuff happening. I think I'm relatively new to this space. I've been doing it for 3 years. I've seen an absolute huge change in what's available for men and boys just in 3-year period. For yourself, is there anything that you like in the men's space right now, or is there something that you want to see a little bit more of as well?
Well, I think what we'd like to see is a great lead from West Streeting. I think a men's health strategy is so important. We'd like to see a minister for men. We'd like to see real political action across the piece, so that the policies are more joined up. We want to see Department for Education taking boys' issues and boys' failure much more seriously than they have at the moment. And there is a big initiative inquiry going on with Public First into white working class education, which we're going to hopefully be able to help shape the gender response to that. So I think these sort of things. I think more resources for men. There's a very good online app for men's mental health that was co-founded by Bear Grylls called Metal. And I'd certainly recommend that. That's just for men to help them with their mental health on the basis that, they want to meet men where they are at. They're on their phones and they want a resource that talks to them as men. And this does the job. And it's the first in the marketplace, I think, to do that. So we want that being wired out, those sorts of resources, so that people can access them in privacy, because men are private as well. That's the other thing. We're weirdly clubbable and uniquely private in a way that I think is quite different, perhaps, from women.
Amazing. Nick, if people have liked what they've heard and they want to find out more about the centre, where's the best place to find yourself and more information?
Okay, if you go to our website, which is www.menandboys.org.uk, you will find all the details about what we're doing, and you can reach us and contact us through the website, and we'd love to hear from you. Whatever your viewpoints and whatever you're particularly interested in, get in touch. We'll be shortly publishing a regular newsletter about what we're doing, and we'll be letting people know in all sorts of different ways the stuff that we're up to, and hopefully the findings we have and the things we're calling for.
Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure. I will leave the final thoughts with yourself.
Well, just to thank you, Lewis, for having me on. I think, as you said, it's not all doom and gloom, but there certainly is hope. I think we're still in the process of expanding the permission space around this, and that's part of our job as the centre, to help do that and do that at pace. But I think people are really switched on to the fact that we now have some issues to do with men and boys that we need to fundamentally address, and addressing the causes will stop the symptoms.